Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first and hopefully last virtual claims summit. My name is Sarah Zuloff. I'm the Compliance and Regulation Manager for the Allegheny Insurance Group, which includes Conemaugh Valley Mutual in beautiful Johnstown, New York. Before that, I was a claim manager for I don't know how many years. More than probably most of you have been in the business. So claims is still my thing. Thank you very much to all of our sponsors. You'll see their names on the screen throughout the day. Their generous support allows PAMIC to provide education, such as this wonderful Education Day. And a special thanks to the Claims Committee. What goes on behind the scenes here is really quite impressive. We started work as a committee on this particular claim summit in November of 2019. And we decided that it would be a great idea to have a claim summit with a, sort of a theme, as it were, of looking forward. And what sorts of things can we expect to see in the future, which is exactly what we're going to be hearing in our first presentation. You're going to see the names of the members of the Claims Committee on the screen. And when you see them in the halls, no, I'm just joking. Just be sure to, if you end up talking to any of them in the course of your business every day, please thank them for the work that they've done on this committee. There's a lot of thankless work here. Now, for all you attorneys and people, anybody that's looking for CE credits, polls are going to be popping up twice a session for CE purposes. In order to, qualify, you've got to answer those questions on the screen. CLE credits will be reported directly to the CLE board. And anybody that needed general CE credits or attorney CLE credits, if you need them, you should have provided your attorney ID number when you registered. Hopefully you've done that. And once you've provided your license number, you will automatically get those CLE credits. If there's any sort of snafu going on with your particular CLE situation, just send Andrea an email at Andrea Strobel, ASTROBLE @pamic.org if you need any assistance with your credits. And happily, the presentations are going to be available on the PAMIC website, and a link to them will be sent after the conference is over. So enough of me talking. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Ron, who has a few exciting things to say about this conference. And then Ron's going to hand it back to me and we will get our day started.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. I have two comments that I'm going to make. The first one deals with the convention this year. So unofficially, PAMIC, it looks like it will be hosting their first in-person seminar since March of 2020, when we did our annual spring conference and then COVID hit. So we've been doing everything virtual to that point. But in August this year, it does look like we'll be going live and in person at the Hershey Hotel. And in the next couple of days, you expect to see registration information, sponsorship information, as well as exhibitor information for those people that want to do that. So just plan accordingly. And Andrea and Britt are working really hard behind the scenes to get that information together. The last thing I want to talk about is just antitrust. I'm not going to read you PAMIC's antitrust statement, but I will raise the concern that if anybody in this meeting feels that we are approaching potential antitrust discussions, I simply ask you to either email us or use the chat or the question function within the Zoom meeting to let us make us aware of that, and we will deal with it immediately. So with that, I want to turn it right back over to Sarah to introduce our first panel and get this meeting started. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you, Ron. That's really exciting that there's going to be potentially an in-person meeting this year. Hooray for that. Our first panel is entitled Technology, Innovation, and Claims Handling. And actually, that's sort of a boring title, but it's a very exciting topic. And leading our panel is going to be Paul Kelejian, who is a vice president of claims for General Reinsurance Corporation, focusing on the casualty line of business. He has 33 years of experience in property and casualty and has been involved in claims in every U.S. state and in many countries globally. Currently, Paul's a line leader at Gen Re on GL and construction claims, and he consults with clients on a national basis. He's based in San Francisco. He got up very early this morning and is a member of NAMIC, the DRI, and the International Association of Claims Professionals. Welcome, Paul, and I'll hand it over to you to introduce our other panelists.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Really appreciate the opportunity. We had hoped to have done this in person in Gettysburg, but it's great to be here virtually. And our topic today is technology, innovation, and claims. And we have a distinguished panel to present to you. Natalie Kaschalk is the Vice President of Insurance Services for Copart, Inc. Her focus with Copart is promoting AI-driven approach to total loss handling, providing informational bulletins to Copart members, and following industry trends regarding technology. Natalie came to Copart in January of 2020 after 30 years of P&C claims experience, primarily with the farmers, where she was VP of Claims at Farmers Insurance. She's also very involved with she was very involved with Farmers Technological Transformation, and she resides in Cleveland, Ohio. Our other speaker is Ken Tolson. Ken's the Global President of Network Solutions Division of Crawford and Company's Platform segment. This division encompasses a range of solutions, including catastrophe services, Crawford inspection services, We Go Look, Workforce Advantage, and Simply Crawford. These divisions span the globe and provide a range of services and solutions to support the digital transformation of the claims lifecycle and embrace disruptive change happening in the P&C marketplace. Ken's a graduate of NC State and originally from Raleigh, North Carolina. Panel, welcome. Panel, our topic, of course, is technology, and we'd hoped to have done this in person in Gettysburg. There's been a lot that's happened in the last year and a half. Can we spend a few minutes and talk about the current technological situation in the industry and where you see this going? Natalie, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you for having us. It's exciting to be joining this conference. And this is it's a passion of mine, and I think for the rest of this group to talk about technology changes. I think actually what we're doing right now, the Zoom technology, that absolutely accelerated over the past year due to COVID, but so did a lot of other changes that I don't think would have happened had it been for COVID for a lot of carriers. You know, in the P&C industry, a lot of virtual estimating. It was kind of starting in a lot of companies, but it was absolutely accelerated because people couldn't actually go out and see people and adjust claims. So there were, we saw a tremendous amount of changes and small to large carriers across the spectrum in the past year. And it was amazing to see how quickly everybody responded to the events that kind of unfolded in the past year. That's just one example. There are lots of them. Ken, would you like to add?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about, I go back to March of 2020. I was in Dallas visiting with a customer starting up a new site, and we couldn't get Ubers to get back to the airport. And that's when it kind of washed over me what was going on. We really were about to go into a total virtual working environment, even worried about being able to get home from which I typically traveled quite a bit. And you think about, I always tell the story of how proud I am of our teams that we were able to so quickly adapt. Before pandemic, we had about 50% of our field workforce didn't work from an office anyway. So we had a lot of the tools, were already either in place or close to being in place. I think about what Zoom and Teams, the Microsoft Teams environment, have allowed us to do. I think there's probably some fatigue with that as well, too, now having been fully over a year into this process. But I think about the agility of our workforce, and all of us have had to adapt to this new normal, but still service the customers, do the things we have to do to keep claims moving forward. I tell the story all the time when I get in front of employees of how proud I am of the change that we made and the adaptability of the workforce. And I think that's just how our industry works. But you're right, in terms of virtualization of the process, we also saw COVID accelerate sort of the priorities and the mandate around virtualizing as much of the claim process as possible. And we'll talk about some of these tools as this session unfolds, but the ability to adopt quickly, try out new technologies, bring them to bear, integrate them into what are legacy claim processes that, let's face it, in our industry don't change quickly because of all the regulatory and the litigation environment that we operate in. We have to be careful about these things, but we also have to be agile. So we're fighting against those two forces. But I would say those are my observations of the past year, and what a year it has been.
It really has. Just a fun story. As I attended many of these virtual conferences with different carriers, one came to mind, and it showed a sharp display of some of the challenges that the individuals themselves had faced. This individual was on the call just like we are now, and he just kept looking down and up and down and up. And then by the end of the call, he got up and he had a newborn baby in his lap, and he was feeding the baby while he was attending the call. And it just, I know many of us have had the barking dogs. I've got 3 of them. I'm just hoping that they don't start barking right now. But you've got the kids who are off of school and the babies, and everybody was confined, and yet everybody really brought it all and made things work. So it was really kind of fun to see that, kind of the ingenuity of the American workforce and how things have changed. And I know at Copart, so we deal with salvage of processing of salvage. One thing we were hit with immediately, because it all came to a halt, almost all of the title processing services for the United States, for every single state, is in person. Every one of us has had to go and process our, transactions, selling a car in an office, and that's the way they did it. And moving those entities into, kind of a digital platform was a tremendous undertaking, but it was something necessary for us to really push forward. And we've managed to really convince about a majority of the states now to go in that direction. There are still some holdouts, but I think, a lot of the states realized that, they had to not only do it, but it also benefited them in the long run, because it just made things faster. The customers, the individuals in the states absolutely responded well to this transaction. And so that's a lot of the stuff that we'll also be talking about, is kind of the benefits for some of these things that have happened over the past year, and the things that we're going to be talking about looking into the future. And, what are the benefits around some of this stuff?
So we have a interactive question feature, and Brittany, if you're ready, we'd like to go ahead and move to our first question. If that's all right. The first question is, has technology become more important in your job function because of COVID? And it would be much more, somewhat, a little, or no. So this is for the audience to please respond. Has technology become more important in your job function over the last year or year and a half because of COVID? While we're getting the answers to that, I'd just like to remind the audience, we do view this as sort of an interactive presentation. So you've got the Q&A feature. please feel free to use it, and we will address questions as they come in during the presentation. While we're waiting for the response to that, we're going to go ahead and start talking about first notice of loss. That's a technological feature that has been developed recently. Natalie and Ken, I know you've both been involved in FNOL technology issues. Ken, can you tell us what you're working on at Crawford with that?
Sure. When, the FNOL concept itself, and think about a CORD and all of the sort of industry standards around FNOL, the challenge today is all the multitude of channels that you can interact with the policyholder today. So we talk about digital and trying to convert our analog processes. Think back to the days of, whether you've got the phone call itself into a call center or to an agent or to or today what you have available to you are web and even SMS, and as crazy as it sounds, we have reporting apps that satisfy or integrate with the Alexa smart home devices. And eventually what will happen in this space as you get more and more down the smart home environment, eventually losses will report themselves. You have this already today in the auto, telematics space with the smart car reporting claims or reporting into OnStar. We've had some of this capability, but it's only going to get more pervasive. We've made a continual investment in what we internally have named digital FNOL, which is really bringing a multi-channel type of approach to FNOL to be able to not only collect the data, integrate with the policy nuances of specifics around coverage and what is covered, what is not covered, but get beyond just the reporting of the loss, beyond that initial loss reporting and into a much better triage state with digital FNOL so that we can get the claim onto the right channel. One of the big changes that has happened to us in the last 20 years is that you have more than one way to adjudicate a claim, whether it's through self-service channels, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but other types of channels and other ways that you can adjust a claim rather than just desk and field. And the more you know at FNOL and the more you know about the property itself or the risk situation itself, the more important, the better you can do the better job we can do in terms of either automating that channeling or putting the adjuster in a position or the decision maker in a position to be able to route that claim down the right path. And that's also your first impression of that interface with the policyholder, however it's done, whether it's done anonymously or done through some type of IoT device. But at the same time, that is the moment of truth too, and a claim can completely be derailed at this moment. So this interaction is extremely important. And you have the more array of services you have, the more opportunity you have for failure. So it's just important that touch point be orchestrated really elegantly with the policyholder.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of my experience in this area was around the development of a digital solution for not only the FNOL for auto, but also it had to look, feel the same for property as well. And it had to, another thing that it was necessary was the look and feel of the policy interaction had to have the same look and feel as well. So if you want to go in and make a payment on your premium, it went through kind of the same process as getting a payment for your claim. And that is really hard to do. And so there's a concept that we use in the industry called omni-channel, which is a little different than the multi-channel. And omni-channel is challenging because it is centered around the customer experience. So the customer is the center point of all of these different things that they could interact with. And it had to feel the same way, and it had to be very simple, which is also in the insurance industry is really difficult to achieve. And then the other big challenge that I think a lot of companies face is how do they pay for the claims? And the payment, the way a customer wants to receive a payment today is very different. If any of us have teenage kids or older, they don't know what a checkbook looks like. The interaction through a bank processing system is Zelle or Venmo. Now it is not, a check. just like they don't know how to actually write an envelope and mail it in through the post office. It is just a very different generation out there, and it is driving a lot of the way we see how to offer our services. And so that has happened, and it's interesting. There's a lot of data coming out that has looked at what does that experience translate into that customer experience for those who have actually gone through that channel. And by far, that experience is much, much better. And I think a lot of it really has to do because it's a lot more simple. You can do it on your time, on your terms. You can get the information that's needed. Hopefully a lot of the information, and the other challenge on this is, I don't want to have to tell you all about my car and all about my house. You should already know it. And so all of that information, if we make it easy for customers to actually just kind of flow through the system with the information we already know, that makes the experience much more, wonderful to them, especially if it results in a claims payment pretty quickly. And you think about companies like a Lemonade. If you've ever gone onto their website, and I've played around with it, we did a lot of playing around with, those kind of tech companies to really understand, what makes them so different. And it really is about the ease of the use. Their technology is so simple. And, for people who have been in the industry for, many of us for a long time, I remember when I first heard about it, and it was met with a lot of skepticism in my area. What about all the fraudsters out there? How are we going to control, and kind of regulate and kind of have the oversight? But the reality is they're making some very, very quick strides in kind of dispelling a lot of that kind of bias that I think we have in the industry on how to handle claims. So now as companies go into the digital arena, they're looking at those companies and saying, what are some things that we can learn from those companies and adapt it in a different platform to companies that have been around for, a couple hundred years. It is a challenge, but it's doable. Ken, anything else you want to add on that?
No, the digital payments, one of the great benefits you have in sort of a check process is sort of the challenge in both the positive and the sort of negative of it is that it slows the process down because getting the money part accurate is really, really important, but it drives the customer crazy in terms of the speed. And these new digital payment methods are instantaneous, moving money around instantly, but you have to be super accurate in how you make payments. You can move currency all over the world. In a prior life, I worked in an accident health division where we were handling claims for Google employees across the globe. And they had some great benefits for their employees, but we were having to settle claims for things that happened to them while they were traveling or, just things that happened to them. We were having to pay in lots of different currencies, and we were having to go through a banking middle person essentially to do currency conversion and buying the currency on those things. And we could send money globally instantaneously for the most part, but we had to be super accurate, and you had to pay that freight of doing that currency and foreign currency exchange back to US dollar back and forth. But the speed is what is just amazing today, the ability to dispense payments. You touched on something I think is really important I think what will be coming down the pipe is the ability for us to, when that claim notice comes through, you'll already know a lot of what you need to know, either about the home or about the car, based on the data that will be gathered either at the moment, either at the underwriting phase or at the moment of the claim itself from telematics information, that it really becomes a matter of issuing payment. The quantum pieces are being automated away gradually through just better and better AI, machine learning, these tools like this. That's what's changing really rapidly, is this ability to know and have clear vision of a loss really soon after the moment of loss itself. And I think that's going to make the payment piece even more important, to be able to simply deposit funds instantaneously. They've automated, it's interesting, in the sort of travel industry, there's a group, it's a part of Berkshire Hathaway, has actually created an algorithm that watches your travel as you're traveling and will literally make a payment if the rules are triggered to that you were delayed or you had an issue or whatever. When those is completely automated, they actually only have a human involved to slow it down over certain, trust issues with the algorithm itself. But, to the point that you can define a coverage that empirically, you can automate a lot of those processes, but you have to get it right, because if you overpay, you don't get it back either.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I believe we have the results of our first question. So Brittany, if you want to make those available, that'd be great. And 60% much more reliant on technology since COVID. That's very much what we were expecting. So very good. Next point we'd like to cover is actually estimating damages, both on property losses and auto physical damage. I know the very new car models now are very complex. They've got a lot of sensors. The most recent years, you got basically a 360-degree view of the vehicle from above you on the driver information center. It's quite complex, and that's been a challenge for body shops and for adjusters to estimate. And there's similar challenges with property losses as well. So Natalie, how do you see technology addressing some of these challenges?
Yeah, it's a tough one. The technology, if you think about from the automobile, really from 2014 models and newer is where the technology really started to hit. And, when you start to look at, just your basic computer that's sitting in front of you now, and you think about what goes into some of these cars, these are becoming computers on wheels and highly technical computers on wheels. There are sensors located throughout these new cars that are designed to, let people know if there's danger or possibly avoid accidents and things like that. And then in the claims arena, the challenge is that every one of those sensors, once they get knocked, have to be recalibrated or they could get destroyed. And as we think about really current state, it's something I'm looking closely at right now. The impact to COVID over shipping and production challenges. I think many of us have heard about chip shortages. Well, these semiconductor chips that actually go into computers and go into your cell phones also go into cars. And they go into the smart technology that's used in your house. I bought a new house and I've got these fancy, dishwasher and fridge where you can, remotely control things. Those all are controlled by chip technology. And all of those chips are in a shortage. Dealerships can't build cars because of them. Or they're trimming off some of their some of the things that they would have originally manufactured that particular car model with. So, it's really exciting to have a car with all of this technology. But when we start to take a look at the claims side, getting these cars repaired and getting them and getting, finding the right people to repair them also is a challenge. There's so much out there in terms of, it's not your typical body shop person from years past that fixes these cars. These are people that have to really understand how technology works. And it requires a different skill set and a different background and a different training and certification. And so these are the challenges that I think the industry is facing as a whole, and it's going to become even more critical in the future. We'll get through these humps in the shipping and the backlog of parts. That'll correct itself. I think the biggest challenge the industry is going to face is the people side of it. It's who's going to fix these things. Where's the workforce coming from? And in our industry, we've got a tremendous amount of turnover in terms of, people retiring and moving on. And, the whole claims arena is not necessarily the jumping in point for many young people. And so we're going to be challenged with finding people to actually handle claims in the future as well. So there's, I know it's a long-winded answer, but there's a lot to it when you start to talk about, the actual cars, what they look like and what property looks like today.
Ken, your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, you and Natalie touched on a lot of this. I remember in 2017, we had just made the acquisition of the We Go Look entity in Oklahoma City, and we were meeting there with essentially the CEO of a company called Tractable. And I don't know, many of you may be familiar with Tractable. They had done a partnership with Mitchell a long time ago, and this was 2017. The young man who was the CEO of Tractable, he looked like he was 12 to me, but I'm just showing my own age. They had built an engine that he could literally take any image off of the internet of a damaged car, and it would give you a high confidence calculation for total loss. And he challenged us to go find any image, and it would try to identify the vehicle and then identify the repairability, 70%, whatever that confidence level was in the repairability. And this was 2017. And they had a production model of this running in Europe at the time. I believe it was with AXA. And it was going after leakage in the salvage space. They hadn't really found a production ready use case in the US. Now, you've probably seen them in the news recently because they've got a new partnership, and there are several carriers in the US talking to them today. CCC also has a similar image analysis platform like this today. So the challenge we found with this is that we could analyze all these images of the vehicle, identify the vehicle, but what wasn't matched up with this was the telemetry data looking at the delta V on the vehicle. What was the speed at impact? What was the momentum and G-forces on the vehicle? And when they get those two things joined up, you're going to find, I think, like just as I alluded to earlier, is that moments after impact, you're going to have a pretty solid payment number. Because today you have all of these visual observations of vehicles are leading to high supplement rates, or really no better supplement rates. They haven't found a way to be super accurate with this, but if you can take enough of with the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence, enough of these instances running through that engine, they will get more and more accurate over time. So I think when it comes to auto, they're going to get this technology is going to catch up eventually, and it will become the norm at some point in time, whether that's 2 years, 5 years out, I don't know, but it will happen there. And we looked at a technology just last week of a company who can analyze images and take the reflectivity, which is one of the main issues of analyzing images on cars because they're shiny. And they can completely neutralize the reflectivity and get better analysis of the surfaces themselves, but they don't have the estimating engine of it built onto it. So that's why they were at our door. But it's just, there's so much venture capital and private equity backing these technologies today that it's just picking up that pace of change. On the property side, property is a lot more complicated simply because of the variability of the construction techniques and the types of homes and the ages and all of those things. But it will come on the high value. You'll see a lot of emphasis on roofing and on flooring and those things to be able to automate the detection. You see it with what ITEL is doing already. We've never have quite figured out how to get a drone to do a better job than the human eye, especially around the denial of claims. That will get better over time. And whether it's actually a drone that delivers it or something else, that's to be determined. But there's just so much, the people are getting their data in a position now to be able to leverage it as an asset, where before so much of it was unstructured, and everybody's starting to get themselves, the tools are more available to get their data into an actionable state. And your image analysis, everything that comes out of the claim file is just another weapon in that data, arsenal.
Absolutely. I'll tell you on the auto liability side, we've been using dash cameras and black box data early on to tell us if we really have a problem on a claim. And if we have a problem, we want to settle it as soon as we can before it gets worse. And that's just another way of leveraging the technology. Let's go ahead and let's move Brittany to our second question for the audience. And this one's going to involve return to work after COVID. Does your company plan to return to the office between now and the end of summer, after Labor Day, by year end, undetermined as yet, or some other arrangement such as a part-time return to the office? So I thought that would be an interesting question. That'd be interesting to get the data points on that for our audience. And while we're doing that, you mentioned a little bit, Ken, about drones. Can you expand on that? That's kind of a topic that's gained a lot of attention lately. I know the usage of drones is spread across many industries, agriculture and real estate and whatnot. How have you seen that implemented in the insurance industry so far?
Yeah, the challenge, and I alluded to it just briefly, I just touched on it around the challenge of damage determination from the drone itself. There's no question that the drone platform, when you're using one of the tools that are out there to autonomously fly the drone, we had actually doubled down and done an integration with the Geomni product to autonomously fly, because we didn't want our adjusters flying drones freehand, because that creates some risk in and of itself. And then our other challenge that we had was the liability risk of, really filming something you shouldn't be filming, which is really where the risk comes from of operating a drone in the air. We have about 2,200 operators within our, with Part 107 FAA licenses within our network of within We Go Look, but we've never seen that really take off. There are lots of use cases, I think, in the cat world where you can fly entire neighborhoods, but you have to have that BV loss, the beyond visible line of sight capability to do that. So it takes a different type of credentialing and a more extensive credentialing. We've seen much. I've seen of late much more interest in the big commercial law space to be able to do even pre-loss scans of properties to look for water intrusion, because you can now, the infrared sensors you can put on these platforms are more available, not as expensive as they used to be. There are also LiDAR measuring platforms that in large complex commercial applications, you can get better scans of the property itself pre and post loss. And then I've seen much more application take off in the civil engineering space to scan topo and changes to a region pre and post loss. But we still have not seen widespread adoption. What you have seen is a massive growth in this whole ladder and inspection network capability, because at the end of the day, when it comes to hail and wind, that is still the predominant sort of method of inspection. And I think until that, the analysis technology gets up and gets proven to say this is indeed hail. What I loved about it in the past is we could run a test square on the whole roof. You didn't run a test square, you tested the entire roof. But the technology has just not gotten to the point that it is defensible, especially when it comes to denying claims. You can pay claims all day long with how you scan and fly on that side of the equation. But eventually, I think that will be more of a satellite play. There are companies now that scan pre and post law from satellite imagery to allow in the triaging process, and eventually that will get to the dollar process as well. So there's just I think it's a battle between whether we can get this data from the satellite level, get it from the drone level, or get it from the pictometry flyover level, which is 3,000 to 5,000 feet in elevation. So
Wow.
that area is still working itself out, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same experience that that we had gone through as well. The use of the technology of the drones it's expensive. It's unless you're in a really highly concentrated area, I don't think it really benefits you. And you've got to have the licenses and all of the other and approval to actually go into the fly space. I think that the emerging area in that space is what you mentioned, Ken, the satellite imagery. It is the amount of satellites that are out in orbit are just incredible. But what has really advanced in the late years is the quality of the capture of the minute details that are down on the ground from a satellite. So you can not only use it for determining pre and post, but you can also use it as a warning mechanism the satellite imagery can tell you of an impending area that's going to be hit with some kind of a monster storm, which we've had many throughout the United States. And it can allow you to give notifications to the people that are living in that area to either seek cover or get out of the way, depending on what is being seen. So I think there are some preventative measures that would actually play out very well for the entire industry in using some of this technology instead of just looking at it from the claim standpoint after the fact.
So one area I'd like to get into now, it's kind of topical in the news because of the Colonial Pipeline issue. Also, recently, one of our industry companies, CNA in Chicago, had a data breach, and they were basically shut down for a week or so. So it's the issue of cybersecurity. Natalie, obviously, it's a huge issue. What sort of emerging issues do you see on the cybersecurity issue other than the obvious, like the Colonial Pipeline type issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the companies, all of our companies, are always testing us with phishing emails and things like that. It seems kind of simple, but it's actually a very powerful tool to be able to detect some kind of intrusion attempts into your network. Because once they're in the network, that's when the disruption occurs. And there's a lot of data out there that suggests that this is happening very frequently. And a lot of these players are, they're they have a tremendous amount of expertise in the area, and they're not local. They're in other countries. I think the pipeline they're talking about, the Russians. There's a lot of Eastern Europeans, the Nigerians come up. There are these groups that really have developed the expertise and are going to look at ways to get around the systems. So that's, on the bigger scale, they're looking at taking things down. They're looking at the ransomware, but on a smaller scale, it's being used for fraudulent claims. So as we start to think about digital processing of claims, that's something we have to also have in the back of our mind, is the attempt at creating not only a fraudulent claim, but fraudulent bank accounts or fraudulent processing. I mean, if you go totally virtual, how do you really know who you're dealing with? So you've got to have the infrastructure that has the dual authentications. Now it's getting into a 3-level authentication of who you are. Are you who you are? Getting that thing on your phone that says you've got to respond to that, so I know I'm responding to you, and it comes back and it's validating the information we already have on you. That will become commonplace. It's kind of a pain, but it's necessary. A lot of banks are doing it now. And so it's kind of interrelated with the fraud, but it's an emerging issue. It's not going away, and it's going to keep getting worse. Absolutely.
We've got the results of our second question. Brittany, if you'd like to go ahead and show those for us. And it looks like between now and summer, the majority, 38% returning to work. And then after Labor Day, certainly by year end. And then undetermined still 22. That's still a pretty big chunk undetermined. And then other part-time. I know I've heard of several carriers that are planning to hotel their employees, so they come in on a rotating basis and then share desks. There's a lot of restacking of offices going on now, and even companies I've heard where they had just really upgraded their facilities just before COVID are now completely revamping their facility usage as well. So that's a very interesting data point there. Next item I'd like to raise, and maybe Ken, you could start the conversation on this, is data analytics. That's a big topic in the industry, not just for claims. I know it's a big topic for underwriters as well. And that may depend on line of business, but I'd like your thoughts on the applicability of data analytics in the claims process.
So, my perspective is only the claims process. So I spent some time in the IT side of our house. I actually served as CIO for almost 4 years. And we implemented a business intelligence platform within the P&C segment of our business. And that was quite an interesting journey because, you know, you're extracting data from all of these various sources. You think about your claim system, you think about your expert systems that you utilize, you think about your policy management system, you think about all of the different data sources that, you know, to the point we were just talking about, if you don't protect those data sources and limit the access to those data sources, you expose yourself from a breach standpoint. So you're walking this fine line of accessing data sources within your ecosystem, but turning them into actionable data. And this touches on so many themes, because when you think about it, we both have to educate our people in utilization of these tools and be able to serve data up and be able to make it actionable. But you also have to look at your core business processes that are generating data. I tell people all the time that you can go buy technology all day long. It's not going to solve your business process issues. If your business processes aren't generating data, but they're generating unstructured data that you didn't have to do something else with, you really need to look at the core of your business processes and ensuring that you're extracting real data so that then you can do something with it. And I go back to this whole underwriting discussion. I believe in the future that when we scan, let's take a typical home, when we scan a typical home for insuring it, we know everything we should need to know about it actually to handle a claim at that point. That house has been scanned by MLS. You actually got a floor plan of it already, a pretty accurate floor plan of it, or you should. I think the more data we can capture at the beginning of that engagement with the policyholder, the more we can do with it, one, to either prevent claims, or two, mitigate or minimize the impact of those claims. So it's really about looking at your whole engagement with a policyholder and turning that unstructured data and images and everything you capture in that interaction into an actionable data element. And that's a big, it can be a boil the ocean type of endeavor. So you have to be really targeted and you have to resource it. I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges we have is it's not just talking about data. It's what are you doing with data? What are you doing about it? Do you have the right training? Are your people skilled? Are you hiring the right data scientist? Or do you have somebody wearing multiple hats in that space? So it's ever important to differentiate. It can be a true competitive advantage if you treat it that way, but it has to be someone's full-time job essentially too. They have to be skilled at it. The tools are just plentiful today about what you can do with it today, from sentiment analysis. It's just crazy what you can do when you get data into a lake from multiple sources and the tools you can apply to it in the machine learning and artificial intelligence, but you've got to get it there to begin with. So that starts with your business process and how you're capturing the data.
Yeah, those are really great points. The whole adage of garbage in, garbage out came to mind when you were talking about that. Because I've been on the receiving end of looking at data trends, and then you start to dig in a little further and you're like, wait a minute, it doesn't kind of pass the sniff test. And it's because there was inaccurate reviews of the data that was coming in and assumptions that were being made before, kind of involving the correct people on what that data was talking to you about. What does it mean? What is that particular field, that entry point, what does that mean? But it's a huge area. I think that the insurance companies that are really winning on the rating side are really honing in on how to get that data right and how it tells you, what is the risk of the individual who is either owning the house, what is the potential driving behavior of that individual. It's changing the landscape. As I think about the use of telematics, that's a huge emerging area in the auto industry. We talked about the cars are computers. The computers are telling you exactly everything that you need to know about the car from the moment that actually even before the person gets in the car. You can understand what's happening to that car. Did the battery run down? You can know that before the person gets in the car. You can get notifications on your phone if you've got a smart, connection. But in terms of the pricing area, that telematics is providing a tremendous amount of insight into the behavior of the drivers, not necessarily the individual driver, but the people that generally drive that car. And it changes kind of your presumptions of what are the rating characteristics that are that are important in determining whether there's a propensity for that individual to get into an accident. You know, you may say you drive 2 to 5 miles, you know, a week, but the telematics is telling you something else. They may only drive that for work, but then their teenager gets in the car and they're driving all over town. You know, there's a lot of insight into that. And then leveraging that knowledge of the data that's coming in from the pricing side and translating that into the claim side is also a gold mine of information. And it's going to change the way we look at claims. It will tell us a lot about what happened in the accident, not only from the property damage side, but also from the injury side. We're going to know about all of the, you know, the airbags. That's an easy one. But what happened to the seat? Did this, you know, you have sensors in your seats now that tell you not only how much you weigh, but how much you moved in the car from an accident. So there's all kinds of data points, but it is overwhelming, and there is no governance around any kind of standardization across the board. Even within one manufacturer, they have a tremendous amount of variations on what that data means. So the company, there's a whole emerging market right now on companies that are trying to normalize that data so that they can help you with understanding, you know, what does this data mean? Because it's so complex and so difficult. And I think we're going to be learning a lot about it in the coming years.
So we've got about 8 minutes left in the hour. Natalie and Ken, I'd like to ask one more question perhaps we could touch on. It seems like during my entire career, it seems like the insurance industry has always been worried about hiring the next generation of talent. And that's true now more so than ever, perhaps. Natalie, how do you see technology figuring into acquiring talent for the industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question for existing people too. When you're starting to institute a lot of these technology changes in the claims arena, it does change the way you handle claims. And so, you know, the thing that I've always talked to people about is the need to be more flexible and to learn, excuse me, to learn about these new technologies and learn how to handle claims in a different manner. Because the reality is, if you don't, you will become obsolete. There are certain things that may never change. The customer interaction for like a customer service rep, I don't think the phone interaction ever goes away. That has come across in every single survey that is done on digital transactions. When a person wants to talk to a person, you need to have a person available, and that person needs to be trained with the empathetic skills that are necessary to kind of get them through what they need to do. But in terms of adjudications of claims, it is a changing landscape, and it will continue to change. And I think that there are a lot of companies that may be hesitant to step their toes into the water, and that will create a disadvantage for the company because claims are going to get processed faster, they're going to get more accurate, and they're going to need people. It's just a different skill set. I don't think people go away. I honestly don't see that happening in my lifetime. You know, people are needed. It's just a different skill set that is needed to process these claims. Ken, what do you think? I know you've got
that's really well said, because it's really to me it's really two things. Is I've always been really fortunate that my curiosity has been indulged. And I always think that's a killer skill of any adjuster, is to be curious, because you want to get to the heart of problems, but you need to understand sort of the environment around the problem to really be good at it. I think. So I think that natural curiosity extends to everything in our new technology or whatever. So I would encourage people to continuously learn, to learn at these technologies that are coming into your space, to at least have a cursory understanding. You don't have to be an engineer, but you do have to understand the application of those technologies, because like you said, while a lot of processes will be automated away, it's understanding how these processes interact with the policyholder or the stakeholders of a claim, and making sure that you're able to adapt and deal with the exceptions, because there will always be exceptions. There will always be the need for that human to human contact. We are in a business that deals with people who've had bad things happen to them. Sometimes, some people, it's the first claim they've ever had. There's some people who've had lots of claims. We all know them, but you really have to be able to deal with people. And I think, if anything, this digital age has hurt us a little bit in that respect. I saw this in my A&H background, where we would have people who would call who want to have a claim addressed or an issue addressed, and our adjusters would respond to them by text or email, thinking that would satisfy the inquiry, but it's not. When people want to be talked to, they want to be talked to. So you have to match the communication to the sophistication or the need of the customer itself. So while digital is great, it's not going to replace the human contact nature or the empathy skills of our business. If anything, it's going to be more in demand, I think, going forward, dealing with the exceptions that arise out of that. So it's, to me, it's two things. It's the technical skill, curiosity to keep yourself abreast in your marketplace, but feed your interpersonal skills and communication skills, because that's where we're the best.
There's been a lot said too about the differences in generations, and there's been a lot said about the millennials and how to attract them into the industry. And now we're even to the generation after the millennials for the entry-level talent coming in. And those people really do like working with technology. And so I see the increased leverage of technology as a plus for the industry to do get the new talent into the industry as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're almost out of time. I'd just like to ask each of you, I'd just like to say thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. And I'm wondering if you have any closing thoughts on key things to look for as we go through the next 5 years as far as technological developments in the industry, benchmarks and important items. Natalie, can you just provide us with some closing thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. I think it's going to be a whirlwind of activity, to be honest. In the past year, there's been a tremendous amount of activity, but I think in the next 5 years, it's going to really start to take hold and take off. Everything from, the smart technology to the connectivity, to the telematics, to the different ways that we interact with the customer. I think it's absolutely going to take off in the next 5 years. But it's still going to have the customer at its core. Ken said it, I said it before. The loss of kind of, losing sight of what that customer is going through will actually be the death of some of these interactions. And so kind of making sure that experience is with the customer in mind is the most important thing that could happen in the next 5 years, and that not get lost in all the crazy technology that's happening. But I think it's going to absolutely change dramatically in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we're at a real tipping point in terms of getting our ecosystems. You're seeing lots of change and that ability to utilize data, the tools. Cloud technology has helped bring this about, where tools that you can go buy, as you consume them and scale these kinds of things today, they're available to everyone, whether it's an Azure or an AWS type of environment. There are tremendous capabilities out there. And the pace of change will only get, faster and faster and faster. The human side of this business will continue to be in hot demand of how we interact with the customer, but the pace of change will just continue to pick up. And I think the tipping point about radically changing claim processes, self-service, the impact of self-service, what you could do, think about tools like Hover and Planer and things like that. We can send links to homeowners and they can capture images without ever sending anybody in their house. That is here to stay. COVID accelerated it, but it was on its way to begin with. We are at a real tipping point, I think, of these types of tools. So it's really important that we as professionals stay abreast of them and understand them. And then, I use this term all the time. I learned it in my IT days, which is to fail fast. You need to test these technologies and decide if they can work. And if not, you jettison them and you move on to the next, but you stay current that way. So that would be my advice.
Absolutely, Ken. Yeah, it's like the Toyota concept of continual improvement. It's going to be absolutely necessary. Yeah. Appreciate it very much, panel. Thank you. Thank you to the audience for all the feedback. And we'd just like to turn it back now to Sarah.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. We went from FNOLs potentially being made by houses and cars to that we are really still fundamentally a people business, and these tools are out here to help us work better. That was so interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to take a break now. We'll be back in 15 minutes at 11:15 for Mike McKenna's eagerly awaited annual litigation update. Thank you very much. See you in 15.
Thanks.
Electrical failure is a big source of fire, personal injury, equipment damage, and lost business. In fact, fires in commercial buildings cause billions of dollars in damages and injure more than 1,000 people each year. What if I gave you the power to look inside your book and detect electrical failure hazards before they cause serious loss of property, income, even lives? Would you be interested? Of course you would. But how, you ask? While electrical failures cannot be totally eliminated, they can be significantly reduced by applying an electrical risk management strategy, one that leverages engineering knowledge, data, and analytics to help your customers keep electrical equipment and systems operating efficiently and safely. HSB's Electrical Risk Management Program brings technology-driven solutions to pinpoint hotspots so equipment owners can get equipment repaired before it fails. Advanced data and analytics allow us to evaluate conditions and make recommendations to mitigate potential losses. And because we understand each risk has a unique set of conditions and each electrical system has unique characteristics, we apply a consultative, client-centric approach to understanding your customer's operations. Working together, we can design an electrical risk management solution to meet your underwriting and risk assessment needs while helping your customers improve their electrical failure prevention efforts. For more information about electrical risk management, contact your HSB representative.
Hi, Ivo Raguzzi, owner and president of Optima Security Services, known as Optima SIU. We've been in business for well over 20 years, and we have serviced the insurance community during that entire time. This is our only line of business. Your 100% solution to all your SIU issues. We take care of it all, which separates us from the pack. We can take care of your fraud plans, your annual reports, your mandatory reports, and most importantly, your training, along with all the investigative needs that you may have. Our reach is throughout the entire United States and Europe. We have handled investigations all over the place, including Alaska and Hawaii. You can come to us. We have experts located throughout the country, capable and able to handle any investigation requirement you may have. I have a fabulous team of experts who have been at this for many, many years, and we're ready, willing, and able to help you in a very professional manner to handle all of your SIU needs. Our experience has shown that we are far more cost effective than an in-house operation. We are truly cheaper, generally about 50 to 60% of the cost that you would have to pay for an in-house team. You know us, you know what we can do. We've presented at your seminars, we have given you information, free tips, and we're always available to you just for questions. Call us at any time, and we're here. We are truly insurance fraud experts.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Mike.
Howdy.
Hi.
Well, I think that first session went without a hitch.
I would agree. That was a really interesting session.
Yes, it was. This technology stuff just wants to make me retire.
I know. It'll be interesting when the first house reports its claim.
Yeah, that's true.
Cars I kind of get, houses not so much.
Hey, Mike, where are your offices? Are you in Philly or Harrisburg?
Philadelphia, the Curtis Center, 6th and Walnut Street. We're across the street from Independence Hall.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I am sitting in the office of Cyrus Curtis, who at one point was the owner of the Curtis Publishing Company, Saturday Post, whatever.
Could be. Saturday Evening Post is the big one. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was
that's
a big
one.
one.
Ladies Home Journal. They were all published in this
Wow.
building. And this was
Okay.
the office. So I've been lucky enough to land in it.
Well,
If I recall, that's a really large building, isn't it?
Yes, enormous
Yeah.
square footage. It's a full city block.
well, your office is very grand, I have to
Oh.
say.
It is, and you're only seeing a tiny part of it. I'm very lucky to have this office.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, you're just down the street from one of my other members, the contribution ship.
Yeah, exactly right. They're about a block down Walnut Street.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. It looks like we're bumping up, well, it's actually 11:16 here.
Okay.
So it looks like we're ready to go. So everybody, that's a past attendee for the Claim Summit always looks forward to the highlight of our first day, which is always Mike McKenna talking about legal updates. Well, he's got a couple of years worth of them to do this year. So I think he's going to be talking pretty fast. But Mike's been a partner in Margolis Edelstein since 1983, serving as the firm's managing partner since 1995. Before joining Margolis Edelstein in 1982, he was assistant general counsel for the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association Insurance Company. He handles files, publishes, and speaks on a broad array of insurance and tort topics. As managing partner, Mike oversees all operations at a firm which has grown during his tenure from 2 to 9 offices. Michael has tried hundreds of jury, non-jury, and UIM arbitration trials with subject matter ranging from auto to premises to fire to products to insurance coverage. He's appeared pro hac VC in Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Puerto Rico. He's also defended or prosecuted appeals before the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, Superior Court, and Supreme Court, and before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and he's going to talk to us today. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature. If time permits, Mike will address them at the end of the presentation. He'll also answer questions offline in the very likely event that we run out of time. And Mike's contact info can also be found in the event material. So Mike, it's all yours.
Thanks. Obviously, it's great to see everyone again. Of course, I'm not seeing any of you. Maybe next year we'll have some return to normalcy. But for now, enjoy the first ever PAMIC Claims Summit in your jammies and sweatpants. Some observations before we get going on what is going to be a race through a lot of cases. A fair title of this presentation would be the greatest litigation hits of the last 2 years, because last year's presentation was canceled right on the eve of what was going to be an in-person claim summit. So I've kept track of those cases and added to those and tried to pare down what gets presented to you today. Complicating that is that our appellate courts have decided that unpublished opinions, that we treat those differently than we used to. Our appellate courts issue many decisions, but they've decided that a lot of them really aren't worth being counted for precedent. You shouldn't be able to rely on some cases that were perhaps more rough justice and legal work going on. So they call those unpublished opinions. And there was a time when they were literally unpublished. It was the people in the case would know what the court had decided. And then as technology improved, unpublished opinions started to show up in the reporters, yet you were not allowed to use those in your briefs or an oral argument. You get in a lot of trouble, as a matter of fact, if you did that. Well, more recently, the courts have decided that unpublished opinions, although they still call them that, they are in fact published, can be cited, although not as precedent. They can be cited for persuasive value. That is to say, wow, Judge, this case that I'm in looks a whole lot like this unpublished opinion case before. Shouldn't you be persuaded the same way you were then? That's a long explanation for the fact that I'm not putting those in my presentation. They're still too unreliable, and there's way too many published opinions that I can report to you. So you'll only see one or two as we go through, and I'll explain why they're in the materials. But you won't see very many unpublished opinions in what we're doing today. If you had any chance to look at your materials, you'll see there are 63 cases in the handout. Well, I started out with 60 minutes to do that. I've already eroded some of that, just explaining all of this. So my time per case is going down as I speak. The good news is I am not going to speak on 63 cases. I kept in the book, but removed from the presentation the more lawyerly blah, blah, blah cases that are probably more important to lawyers than to claims personnel. So they're still in there. This is, after all, a CLE. We are giving continuing legal education credit for this. So I'm still reporting on those matters, although I won't be spending time on them in the oral presentation. Right up front, I want to tell you about a certain type of case that I am not going to handle that people are probably curious about. And those are COVID-19 cases. You know, do I have coverage? I mean, is there a property damage? Is there the popular one, business interruption? I've been closed down and I want you to pay my business interruption losses. I am not covering those for the main reason being that they're almost all at the trial level, and we really don't have significant appellate guidance in the country on those types of claims. So it may well be that next year and the year after, I'll be reporting to you about how that all turned out. In the interim, what you can take some solace in is that the decisions have been almost uniformly in favor of carriers. Particularly in Pennsylvania and federal court, it's hard to find a decision that does not come down in favor of the carriers and against coverage. So for now, the courts are finding there is no property damage. They are enforcing those virus exclusions that were put on most of your policies following the SARS scare, whatever that was, a decade ago. You started to see virus exclusions on policies. Those are being enforced. The courts are not finding property damage, and they are not granting coverage for business interruption. Again, stay tuned on that. I know many of you are in the midst of that. But there's just too many trial level decisions to report on that, and trial level decisions aren't binding on anybody except the parties to those cases. Next, before we get going on the cases, there was already reference to a Q&A opportunity that you have, and please ask all the questions that you want. I assure you I will not be answering them during the presentation. I can't imagine I'm going to have time to do that. However, anybody who asks questions, I'll answer them. You just have probably to wait to the lunch break or this afternoon or tonight or tomorrow, whenever I can get to them. If I get any questions, I'm glad to answer those. In addition, in the materials, at the end of the materials, you'll see there's a bio of me, a big picture and whatnot, but it gives my office phone address, my cell phone address, and my email address. Feel free to contact me at any time with any questions about this presentation or anything else that comes up. Finally, before we get to the presentation, I just want to inject some news of which I think we can all be proud. Beating out New York, both the city and the state, and the entire state of California, and by the way, Dallas and the entire state of Texas didn't even make the top 10. The Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court tied for first in the American Tort Reform Association's Judicial Hellholes list. It's a list that they both contributed excessive verdicts and litigation tourism which causes them to tie for first. This is a repeat win for the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, but now they are in a contest with their own Supreme Court in reaching number one on that list. So with all of that as a background, and assuming technology works with me here, we want to go to the PowerPoint where I will give you a review of these cases. There we go. We have a PowerPoint. And I will go through these as efficiently as I can to get us through. First up, the topics are coverage. There we go. And if we can get to the coverage screen, the first set of cases we're going to talk about are under the rubric four corners. If you do any type of coverage work in Pennsylvania, you'll recognize that. Pennsylvania is one of those minority of jurisdictions that follows the four corners rule in determining whether coverage is triggered. What you do is you take the four corners of the complaint and you measure those against the insurance contract to find out whether coverage has been triggered. You don't look at extrinsic evidence, investigations, discovery, depositions. Nope. None of that is what is used to determine whether or not your coverage is triggered. It's triggered by whatever the allegations are in the complaint. So with that background, I've put three cases in here about four corners. First is the Erie Insurance Exchange versus Moore case. In that case, this crazed gunman, after sending a note to his family about what he intended to do, went and killed his former spouse, shot her, and eventually kept his word and shot and killed himself. But in between, he got into a fight with the ex-spouse's boyfriend and shot him in the face. And that's who Moore is. I mean, he wants coverage. He's been shot in the face. The complaint that is filed as a result of this incident says that the crazed gunman negligently allowed the gun to discharge into the victim's face. And the question is, well, given all the evidence that we're looking at here, does Erie have to defend that? And the answer is yes, because there was a sufficient factual background laid that there was a tussle and they were wrestling back and forth. The gun was there for sure. The guy was crazed and was certainly intent on killing people, but there's at least an allegation that he did not intend to shoot this victim in the face. So Erie's duty to defend is triggered. Next case, Kylie case. This is another assault. In this case, it's an elderly patient who allegedly assaults her health aide. And a claim is brought by the health aide against that elderly woman. And the claim is turned into the woman's homeowner's coverage to get coverage for that. And the carrier, the contribution ship, denies coverage because the allegation is intentional assault. This old woman started smacking me around and intended to do it. That's an intentional assault that does not trigger a duty to defend. Kylie is the conservator or guardian of the elderly woman. She said, whoa, now before you deny coverage in a case like that, granted, it says that this old woman assaulted the health aide, but you need to figure out whether or not she had dementia and was even capable of forming the intent of committing an intentional act. Because how can she assault someone if she doesn't even have the mens rea, doesn't have the ability to process that type of information? Court says, no, that's a good example of that extrinsic evidence that we don't look at in deciding coverage matters. You have a duty to defend. I'm sorry, there's no duty to defend. There's no coverage in that case because the allegation was an assault. The final four corners case is SAPA. SAPA provided a component part to Marvin Windows. A lot of complaints to Marvin about how the product turned out. Marvin settles those complaints with the consumers, but then pursues SAPA for the money they had to spend on to do that. And they allege that your component part was defective, therefore you owe us money. What the court found, the Third Circuit, was the allegations when you were dealing with policies that were occurrence policies that defined an occurrence as an accident. This wasn't an accident. The Converter rule got triggered. Therefore, there was no coverage triggered within the four corners of that complaint. However, with regard to policies that didn't define occurrence as an accident, but instead relied on intentional harm or reasonably expected harm, that's different. That's a factual allegation. You can't really resolve that just on the face of the complaint. So that is remanded for further evidence, further hearings to find out whether coverage is triggered. Next on coverage, since I just mentioned Converner, we'll mention Converner again. Again, it's still the SAPA case. And just to remind everyone that Converner was that gift from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that said work product, faulty workmanship claims, well, they're not covered by GL policies. You need a performance bond for that type of work. A GL policy doesn't cover that because faulty workmanship, defective workmanship, failure to abide by contract terms, those aren't accidents. And if an occurrence is defined as an accident, there's no coverage. So that is exactly what happened in the SAPA case. Marvin was alleging that this defective component was inserted into the window, which then became defective. There was no damage to anything else, so therefore no coverage. PMA versus Pottstown Industrial, by comparison, this is a landlord who is engaged not just to provide the property, but is also required to make roof repairs to prevent leaking. The landlord does a bad job, the water leaks in, it damages the tenant's inventory. That type of claim is not barred by the Converner rule. It's damage to something other than the insured's product, so therefore coverage is required. Next on coverage is reservation of rights. You're all familiar with reservation of rights. You send a letter to the insured to say, well, we're investigating this, or we're providing a defense, or we're making a partial payment, whatever it is you're doing, but you reserve your rights because there are issues on coverage that might yet still need to be resolved. In Pennsylvania, it's actually an insurer-friendly jurisdiction where it's kind of loose on what the requirements are. Your reservation of rights ought to be in writing, it ought to be fairly prompt, and it ought to be fairly specific. And fairly is all the wiggle room that you get to have a reservation of rights. In this case, MAK Services, it's a snow and ice removal company. They buy coverage from Selective, which has a snow and ice removal exclusion. So somebody dropped the ball there. And of course, there is the inevitable snow and ice claim. Selective receives the claim, issues what you would call a generic reservation of rights. We have the claim, and by the way, we reserve our rights, whatever they might be. And at a much later date, they say, well, you know what, we don't provide coverage for snow and ice removal, so therefore we don't have coverage for this loss. Court says, no, that's too late. Although we're kind of loose on prompt and specific, we can all agree that this was not specific. Your original reservation of rights didn't even mention snow and ice removal, therefore that's waived. Next, as we rush through coverage, is replacement cost policy. You folks, I know, are certainly aware of this. There's a two-step payment process. One, our Supreme Court has confirmed that that's a valid way to handle a replacement cost payment. You pay actual cash value until their repairs are actually undertaken. And here the issue was whether or not, when repairs were not done, and Korak didn't do repairs, whether or not the actual cash value definition may validly exclude general contractor overhead and fees. And the answer is it can. And so you define, if your policy defines it to exclude that, in fact, all you owe is the actual cash value until repairs are undertaken under that replacement cost policy. Finally, I believe under coverage, we have the Berg case, which I have put in the materials only because I have reported on this case several times before. It goes back to 25 years ago. Berg had an accident in his Jeep Cherokee and had a collision loss claim with Nationwide. And, Nationwide, it's a total loss. It's not a total loss. We think you ought to get fixed. Go to our approved contractor. And maybe now it's a total loss. It's a lot of back and forth. And the Bergs just got so fed up with all of that, they sued Nationwide. And Nationwide dug in. And this case is 25 years old. because it was up and down and up and down and up and down. And by the time of the third trial, the trial judge awarded $21 million against Nationwide in bad faith damages. Basically taking the position that this was typical of Nationwide to do this sort of thing to its insured. So we want to send them a message that they really hear. And since it's a big company, they ought to hear $21 million. So that ought to send shivers up the spines of all of the claims personnel at the summit today, because boy, did you not want to be associated with this case if you were at Nationwide. The Superior Court overturned the $21 million verdict. That's the good news. I reported on that a couple of years ago. The Supreme Court doesn't agree on that. That's evenly divided, 3 justices to 3 justices. So by the skin of their teeth, Nationwide has that Superior Court result affirmed. That is the one that vacated the $21 million award, where, boy, the Supreme Court was awfully close to reinstating that $21 million award on a collision loss claim all those years ago. Okay, well, sticking with coverage, but a different type of coverage, let's talk about UM/UIM coverage. And in particular, we'll start out with stacking. I'm probably the only one on the line who's old enough to remember all of this, but there used to be a Pennsylvania No-Fault Motor Vehicle Insurance Act that went into effect in 1975. It was repealed in 1984 and replaced with the Pennsylvania Motor Vehicle Responsibility Law, the law we have now, which was then itself extensively amended by the Act 6 amendments in 1990. Now, I got to tell you, sad to say, physical appearance notwithstanding, I was around for all of that. I was a lawyer for the 1975 no-fault law, and then for the original MVFRL, and then for the amended MVFRL. When the MVFRL was amended in 1990, 30 years ago, right, more than 30 years ago, there were provisions that you could reject UM and UIM coverage by filling out the appropriate forms, and that you could reject stacking of those coverage, again, by signing the appropriate forms. I included these cases, one, because they're important to people who are doing auto work, but it's hard to believe. It's 31 years later, and the courts are still trying to figure out how you stack and don't stack, and how you reject and don't reject these coverages. Years ago, the Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers Association, they used to be called the Plaintiffs' Lawyers, but then to disguise themselves, they became the Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers Association. Their motto was, don't sign and everything's fine. What that meant was, don't sign any of the waivers and you get the maximum amount of coverage. It turns out, while that's true, they probably didn't need to go to that trouble, because you can not sign and still get all of that coverage because of all the ways that it gets done incorrectly by insurance companies. By the way, the Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers Association, for those of you keeping score, they're not called that anymore. It is now the Association for Justice. So it used to be when your defense lawyers went into court, they were a lawyer and the guy on the other side was a trial lawyer. Now they go in, your lawyers are still just lawyers, but the guys on the other side are associates for justice. With that as a background, let's talk about these 3 stacking cases. They're pretty straightforward. When you're buying coverage, you need to get new waivers of either the original rejection of the coverage or of stacking. And here in Bernard, increasing UM/UIM limits, that's buying more coverage, got to get new stacking waivers. Klein versus Travelers, they add a new vehicle to an existing policy. Well, that's buying coverage, so you need new stacking waivers. The third case, Franks versus State Farm, the Superior Court issued an opinion that said when you are subtracting vehicles from an existing policy, you need to get new stacking waivers. Bit of a head scratcher, since all the prior cases had talked about getting more coverage and new coverage to cause the stackers. That Franks opinion was no sooner issued than it was withdrawn by the Superior Court, which allowed argument en banc. I don't even know if that argument's taken place, but probably next year I'll be reporting to you how Franks turned out in the Superior Court and whether that gets appealed further to the Supreme Court. Still within stacking, we have 2 more cases that are a different type of issue in stacking. One is the King case. This is factually complicated, probably won't apply to you, but it's still the kind of thing you need to know. And King owned a vehicle. He insured it under a Century policy, under a corporate policy, a corporation name, but he wasn't named in the policy. He owns the vehicle. It's insured under a policy that he gets and he pays for, except it's a corporate insured. He is not named in any way. He's in the vehicle with his girlfriend. He's involved in an accident. He's gotten the money from Century, the primary coverage from Century, but now he's looking for excess coverage from Erie. Erie says, not so fast. You have a non-stacked policy. So we're not arguing about whether the non-stacking is valid or not. That has been validly signed for. But what the court rules is that people like King, who are occupants of a vehicle, they're really guests. They are not insureds. Insureds under the MVFRL is the named insured. He wasn't relative in the household or spouse. Well, he's none of those things. So he's really a guest in the vehicle he owns with regard to the Century coverage. So that when he comes to Erie and looks for coverage and Erie says, nope, you're non-stacked and you've already got money, you can't get it from us. Court says, no. He is really a guest. He hasn't gotten any money as an insured, so he hasn't stacked anywhere, so he gets to get your money. In Grix versus Progressive, again, it's a stacking issue, which is complicated by a second issue. Grix, a young girl, leaves her parents' home for 6 weeks, has her new place. It's where she's going to live hereafter. But like any number of kids that leave empty nesters behind, she has a room there. She has stuff there. She shows up regularly for cash and meals. And in addition, she is still a named driver on the Progressive policy, not a named insured, but she's a named driver. So the question is, after her accident, is she able to stack coverage? She gets coverage because she's in the vehicle that is covered, but can she stack those coverages? The Superior Court reviews all the facts and says, no, she really left the home, wasn't planning to live there anymore. The part where she goes back and whatnot, well, she's just a visitor, so she is not able to stack. I put this in, even though it's a non-precedential opinion, because the Supreme Court has granted aliquotter. So we're going to find out whether or not being named as a driver on the policy under these facts is enough to get you coverage. Continuing with coverage, I see you have a poll question. I will click out of that. Next up is policy reformation. What this means under UM/UIM, you have a valid rejection of coverage, but the insured says, yeah, but it was all done the wrong way. I really do have the coverage, even though it's been rejected. So he brings an action. Now here's a bit of litigation tourism in Philadelphia County, which has absolutely nothing to do with the dispute, and says, I want you to reform this policy to add UM/UIM coverage. And the question is, when you do that, well, okay, assuming you are successful, well, what are the terms of the policy? You know that when you issue a policy, it's just, you don't just list an amount. There's an endorsement, and that endorsement incorporates the other terms of the policy, the conditions and the definitions. And that was the question here. We all agree that UM is not on this policy. You, Matthews, want to add it to the policy, but when you do, what are the terms? What are you getting on it? And why that is important is that the Erie policy, had it provided UM, had a choice of venues provision, which would have prevented it being in Philadelphia, would have had it in Bucks County. The court says, well, I don't agree. I'm not ruling on whether or not you can add this coverage. What I can tell you is you're going to be stuck by the definitions, conditions, provisions of the policy, including the venue one. And he ships the case from Philadelphia County, I think, to Bucks County, where it belongs. Next, we have the MVFRL, sticking with the march through statutes. A couple of quick decisions on MVFRL. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the Evans case. Coverage on that depends on whether or not the PTSD is caused by the accident, in which case no coverage, or is it caused by injuries from the accident, in which case there is coverage. You would think that any well-informed claimant or well-informed doctor or well-informed lawyer who talks to either the claimant or the doctor can figure out that probably the injuries have something to do with the post-traumatic stress disorder. And when that happens, there is coverage. Next, under MVFRL, is not a direct MVFRL claim, it's a tort claim where Faris wants to put in $900,000 in future medical expenses. And the lawyers on the line know that when you're dealing with future medical expenses, one, the claimant usually never incurs them. And two, they always try to state them at face amount, even though they're ultimately paid by insurance, in which case they're not recoverable, or they're paid under an insurance policy, including the liability policy of the tortfeasor, so they ought to be reduced by cost containment. Here, the Superior Court says, and the Supreme Court denied Cotter, that future medical expense claim in a tort suit is not reduced by cost containment. So that full $900,000 went in. Not only was Faris not likely to ever undergo that treatment, but in any event, it would have been reduced by cost containment. And that's not the evidence that goes in the tort case. Safe Auto, Oriental Guillermo, the important takeaway from this case, the facts are weird and it's unlikely they would show up in your cases, but what the court does say is that the burden of providing financial responsibility is on the owner of the vehicle, not on the insurance carrier. So for instance, a carrier is not required to have, an omnibus insured section. Policies often say we cover you and relatives and spouse and anybody using your vehicle with permission. Well, you're not required to have that provision in the policy. And here it was anybody else using it with permission. So the vehicle was operated by permission. It was insured by Oriental Guillermo, yet the policy excluded coverage for a resident of his household that wasn't a relative that was using the vehicle. So that's the important takeaway, is you can alter your policy to limit that omnibus insured in ways that you want. Let's see, sales, that's just the IME provision in the MVFRL. It's rare that you fight about IMEs and MVFRL. So many people apply low limits, but when you're dealing with large limit policies or those combo policies, you'll often need a medical exam. Just be aware that after years of figuring out how to get around the provisions in the statute, the provisions in the statute are going to be enforced. Insurers have the obligation of getting and filing a motion and getting an order from the court upon cause shown to establish the legitimate need for an IME. So you're jumping through a whole lot of hoops, you're hiring a lawyer, you're spending a lot of time and work to get an IME. That is now the law of the land through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Next, again, another statute, ways that you can owe money, is the Unfair Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Law, which we usually just refer to as the Consumer Protection Law. 3 cases very quickly to go through there. First off, you'll notice that the first 2 deal with Ameriprise Financial. Be wary, apparently, if you're dealing with these folks, according to these cases, since they have been called up and found guilty of unfair trade practices and violations of the Consumer Protection Law. In the first case, it's a debate over what the catch-all provision means. When you deal with the Consumer Protection Law, it has a laundry list of things that you're not allowed to do to consumers that give rise to a violation of the Consumer Protection Law. But if you haven't triggered one of those, there's a catch-all provision, the very last one, and it used to say engage in other fraudulent conduct, that causes harm. Well, that got amended several years ago, where it now says engage in fraudulent conduct or deceptive conduct which creates a likelihood of confusion or misunderstanding. Well, in this case, Ameriprise had gotten defense verdicts at trial on fraudulent, both intentional and negligent misrepresentation, fraudulent and negligent misrepresentation. They got defense verdicts on that, and they figure, well, boy, that's the golden shield that gets me through the Consumer Protection Law count as well. But no, they were found in violation of that count because what they do doesn't have to rise to the level of fraud or even negligent misrepresentation, as long as they're doing something which is causing confusion to the ultimate consumer. A cause of action is stated. You might see coverage issues on this down the road where you're trying to deny coverage based on intentional acts or intentionally caused harm, yet under this catch-all provision, that's really not necessary to be found liable under Consumer Protection Law. The second Ameriprise case, again, dead in the water. They got caught with a violation of the Consumer Protection Law. The judge said, well, not only that, I'm going to calculate treble damages against you under the statute. And what he did was he took the damages, he tripled them, and then he added the 2 totals together, essentially to come up with quadruple damages. Not how it works. Triple damages means you take the original damages and triple them, and that amount is the amount that's awarded. Finally, in the Wenk versus State Farm case, the good news for you folks is that the consumer protection law is not applicable to claims handling allegations. Sale of insurance products, yes, but claims handling, no. Consumer protection law doesn't apply to that. However, the court felt compelled to point out, don't worry, there is still the Unfair Insurance Practices Act, which they can be in violation of. And while that may not give a private cause of action, violation of that statute can give rise to evidence in an actions on insurance policies claim, that is the bad faith statute, where you can get punitive damages there. So you've dodged a bullet under the consumer protection law, but the court felt compelled to point out other places where you are vulnerable to those claims. Next, let's jump into evidence. Now we've gone through all sorts of ways that you can owe money. Let's quickly look at some ways that witnesses apply to those actions. First is a phrase that it didn't see for years and years, and now it shows up twice in 1 year, and that's for attorney eyes only. And what the phrase means is that the court releases materials that are disputed in discovery. One side wants them, the other side doesn't want to give them up. The judge can say, give them up was for attorneys' eyes only, meaning quite literally, only the attorneys on the other side get to look at the documents, not their clients. It's just the lawyers get to see it, nobody else. And in the first case, it involved tax returns. Cabot Oil was suing lawyers that had repeatedly represented parties that sued Cabot Oil without foundation in law or facts. So that results in a Dragonetti claim against the lawyers on wrongful use of civil proceedings, we call the Dragonetti law, and they're trying to get compensatory and punitive damages against the lawyers. And in discovery of those claims, they say, give us your tax returns so we can figure out how much money you have so we can figure out our punitive damage angles on this. The judge orders release of those documents on a for attorneys' eyes only basis, and the Superior Court affirms that. They do note in a curious footnote that the partners in those law firms, the ones that weren't parties, and the spouses of the lawyers that were in the case, well, they may have had privacy rights, and they maybe had a pretty valid objection to these materials being released since it was their privacy that was being invaded. And what the court kind of blows off is, well, yeah, but they could have intervened in this action and sought privacy, and they didn't. Now, of course, that presumes that the law partners knew about the action, and the spouses knew about the action and knew about the discovery and even had the opportunity, the knowledge enough to intervene. But there you go, the materials were turned over, and the privacy rights of at least those other partners and spouses were violated according to the in result of the court order. The second case, CLL Academy, again, turnover documents, don't want to. The judge ordered for attorneys' eyes only. That was incorrect. Here, the issue was privileges, and privileges don't get decided by for attorneys' eyes only. They get decided by in-camera review by a judge. In-camera meeting, the judge gets the materials in his office. He looks at them and figures out whether they get released or not based on whether there's a privilege or not. It has nothing to do with limiting the release to lawyers only. Continuing with witnesses, I have 3 cases on this page. One's a need for interpreter. That's within the court's trial discretion. Lawyers who are on the call have probably dealt with this at some point. Taking a deposition or a testimony on whether direct or cross-examination through an interpreter is hell. It's all the jokes or the tropes that you've seen, you know, the long back and forth. You ask a question that calls for a yes or no answer, and there's a long exchange between the interpreter and the witness, arms waved, raising, voices raised, and then they turn around and say, yes, you know, a one-word answer. Yeah, that happens. And it also gives witnesses, I think, an unfair advantage, and they get to hear a question twice, since many of them, I should say, don't need an interpreter, and they get time to figure out what their answer might be. And there's always plausible deniability when an incriminating answer is given. I never really understood that question. But there you go. That's all within the trial court's discretion. The Saez case, it's a sad case. Saez was up on criminal charges for sexually abusing his 9-year-old stepdaughter. And to prove the case, the prosecution brought in his 6-year-old biological daughter to testify that he had similarly abused her when she was 4 years old. he was convicted. I guess that's the good news at the end of that. On appeal, he claimed that his biological daughter should not have been allowed to testify, given that she was so young, and for instance, couldn't give a definition of taking an oath. What happens in Pennsylvania is the general rule is that everybody is a competent witness, everybody. And yet, after that, you just have to prove that they're not competent witnesses. But they start out, the general rule, being competent. For kids under the age of 14, the court is supposed to hear, and in this case, did have a tender years hearing, where the judge talks to the witness. It gets an idea of whether they can observe things, remember things, recount things, and whether they have a concept of telling the truth. In this case, the judge did that with the 6-year-old daughter, was convinced that she was competent to testify, and did. And again, that's within the discretion of the trial judge. The final witness case is the Dead Man's Act. Pennsylvania is one of the minority of jurisdictions that follow the Dead Man's Act. And it's probably best if I just read from the definition here so as to not get it wrong, but it's where a party to a thing is dead. And a thing can be an accident, a contract, a transaction, an event of some type. So when a party to a thing is dead, the surviving party to that thing, contract, tort action, whatever it might be, is not competent to testify about the thing. And so it's a great protection that you often have in cases as long as you take care of it. You can waive the dead man statute protection. You waive it by engaging in discovery. You know, the case goes to litigation, you take a deposition, you send out interrogatories, document requests. There's things that you can do where you waive your right to rely on the dead man statute. Here, that didn't happen. The plaintiff is a tenant. The dead man is the landlord. The tenant falls down steps. At a later time, the landlord dies. The lawsuit is brought. The tenant was barred from testifying about the condition of the stairs because the landlord wasn't dead. He wasn't there to dispute whatever that version would be. And since they had not waived it by engaging in discovery, the dead man statute applied and ended up being judgment for the defendant in that case. Continue with witnesses. We jump to privileges. Where we have different ways you can have a privilege. The one that you're probably most familiar with is anticipation of litigation. If you do things analyzing a case, anticipation of litigation, you figure out the strength or weaknesses of claims or defenses. That's typically covered as being done in anticipation of litigation. It's protected. Here, Johnson Matthey, after an accident, hired a consultant to figure out how and why the accident happened so that there wouldn't be further accidents. Well, that's not anticipation of litigation. So those materials by those consultants had to be turned over in discovery. The fact that litigation is always possible is not enough. And you can't retroactively create a trail of saying, well, we really meant to hire them for that. And now, if you're going to be doing that, make sure that very early on you're identifying why a consultant is hired or an expert is hired, and make sure that it's in anticipation of litigation. In Busamra, Excella Health got outside legal advice after an incident that would normally be protected under attorney-client privilege. Here, however, they gave it to a PR consultant, I guess, to make sure that the PR was fashioned to match what the legal advice was. That's waiving the attorney-client privilege. So that protection that normally would have existed was waived in that case. In the Newson case, in-house counsel interviews witnesses after an incident. He offers to be their lawyer. None of them actually take them up on that. So therefore, there is no attorney-client relationship. The other attorney is free to contact these witnesses and talk to them. The in-house counsel's notes, though, are still protected. That's attorney work product. He was still able to hold on to that, but he could not prevent opposing counsel from contacting and interviewing these witnesses on his own. Next, one final case on evidence, it's the learned treatise exception. Now, even lawyers don't deal with this very regularly, but the gist of it is what you learn in law school is if you're going to cross-examine an expert, you get a treatise that you think is valuable, you have him identified as a learned treatise. He concedes that the industry or profession that he's in acknowledges that that's a learned treatise. You then use that to cross-examine the witness to show how his opinions don't track with what's in the learned treatise. In this case, the Charlton case, the lawyer tried to do that, but the expert wasn't biting. He would not acknowledge that the the treatise that was being tendered to him was in fact a learned treatise and was recognized in the industry as such. That did not stop the trial attorney, who continued to use it throughout the rest of the trial, reading it to the jury in his closing statement. He used it as basically affirmative evidence in his case by reading a book to the jury, making it seem like there was no doubt about the legitimacy of the claim. That resulted in a $40,258,000 verdict. Now, in fairness to Philadelphia County, this was not in Philadelphia County, so there really wasn't any litigation tourism going on. It was in Delaware County, which I guess is close enough to be pulled into that Philadelphia family. It was overturned on appeal. The Supreme Court says, and the Superior Court says, and the Supreme Court denied aliquotter. No, this was beyond the pale. The lawyer had no right to be reading that book, that treatise, to the jury. Finally, now we'll get to tort, the ways that your insureds do things that cause claims. Let's start with landowner obligations. The first one is Kaminsky. Kaminsky's walking on the sidewalk outside the South Meadow place of business, falls, and wants to get business invitee protection. That is, that the landlord would owe the highest protection to him because, after all, he fell in front of their business. Well, sidewalk pedestrians are licensees, not business invitees, and the landowner still owes a duty to them, but boy, that injured party has a high hill to climb. The injured party has to show that the landlord knew of the condition, realized that it posed an unreasonable risk of harm, expected the licensee, that is the victim, not to discover it, and then failed to fix it or failed to warn anybody about it. And finally, that the victim himself didn't know or have reason to know that the defect was there. Kaminsky couldn't prove that in this case, which is why he was asking for the better business invitee protection. So judgment for the defendant is affirmed by the Commonwealth Court, and the Supreme Court denied aliquotter. The Pearson case, well, I just entered this, I put this on the list. It does, it has some great quotes in it. I'm not so sure it states any new or exciting law, but after all, it's a Cowboys fan at an Eagles-Cowboys game. At the link, he goes into the restroom at halftime wearing his Cowboys jersey, at which point he says he's knocked to the ground, stomped on, stripped of his jersey, beat up, and eventually suffers a broken ankle. There was no security guard in the restroom to prevent all of this from happening. He sues because the Eagles didn't have adequate security. And incredibly enough, or maybe not, given the high verdict issue with Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, I would say, in spite of the fact that he was a Cowboys fan, he gets a $700,000 verdict at trial. I guess there was careful voir dire to remove Eagles fans from the jury. That is reversed on appeal. He really has to show that the Eagles' security system was inadequate and had to show that there was prior notice of incidents in restrooms such that a security guard ought to be there. He failed to prove that, so the verdict is overturned. And again, appeal denied. That's the Superior Court ruling that, and the Supreme Court denies aliquotter. A couple of great quotes from that case that I certainly hope to use in future litigation. Quote, "Places of general public resort are also places where what men can do, they might," end quote. Well, that's great if you're a defendant. Second quote, "A business invitee," and again, the business invitee entitled to the highest protection, as Pearson was, "A business invitee cannot expect a possessor of land to defeat all the designs of felonry." Wonderful quote. Can't wait for a case where I can stick that in. Next, on torts, impari delictu. Well, I don't know, probably most people, not only on this call, but in the legal community say, yeah, what the hell does that mean? That's an interesting Latin phrase. In this case, Albert gets drugs from a friend of his who gets them from Shealy's drugstore. He ODs on the fentanyl. He then sues Shealy's drugs for releasing the drugs to his friend, which then ended up in his hands so that he could OD on them. The court turns his case down and says it is barred by in pari delictu. And that's the Superior Court affirms that. And the Supreme Court accepts aliquotter. So there's going to be argument and eventually a decision by the Supreme Court on this. So for what it's worth, what the hell is in pari delictu? Well, it's part of a longer phrase. In pari delictu potior est conditio defenditis et possenditis, which doesn't go back to Rome. It is indeed Latin. It goes back to the 1700s in England. So this is part of English common law, that in case of equal fault, the position of the defendant or one in possession is the better position. So the gist of it's going to be why they had this back then and continue to today is courts should not get involved in sorting out disputes between wrongdoers. Now that would have made more sense, I would think, if Albert was suing the friend who gave him the drugs because they're both wrongdoers. It's not clear why Seeley's is a wrongdoer where this law would apply. And perhaps that's why the Supreme Court granted Alicotter to sort that out. But anyway, I included it so that you will have something to say at your next cocktail party when you just want to chat and throw out some phrases, throw out in pari delictu. And now you have a translation of what it means. Continuing with torts. Oh dear, sorry, let me, continuing with torts, false arrest, false imprisonment, and defamation. I think I had originally titled this, ways to say things and get in trouble. And that's what this is about. In the Braswell case, Braswell goes to a convenience store, makes a small purchase, pays with a 20, gets his change, but he gets change for a 10. He says to Wallard, you shortchanged me. She says, no, you gave me a 10. So they get in a debate back and forth about whether he tendered a 10 or a 20. Braswell calls the police, but then also takes a 10 out of the till, figuring I'm entitled to $10 more. He takes it, calls the police, but leaves. The police show up, only get Wallard's version of events. They go find Braswell, arrest him, put him in jail, where because he can't make bail, he stays for 4 months. After 4 months, the DA is getting ready to try the case, realizes that there's a security video of everything that happened there, checks that out and says, well, I guess we better not be charging Mr. Braswell. So they let him go, and Braswell sues Wallard for false imprisonment and false arrest. Wallard says, I didn't arrest you. I didn't imprison you. I don't owe you any money. And in fact, the trial court agrees and says, no, you're free to go. Superior Court says, no. You can be liable for false arrest and false imprisonment, even though you didn't arrest someone, you didn't imprison anyone, or even detain anyone. But if you gave information to the police which caused that to happen, you're just as liable as though you did it yourself. In Burns, so Wallard said things to the police, and it ended up causing her and actually her employer money. In Burns versus Cooper, Burns puts a claim into her homeowner's carrier saying, I had items stolen. The carrier, in investigating that loss, contacts her estranged husband, and he says, well, I don't think that event happened. In fact, I don't think she even owned the type of stuff that she claimed was stolen. In fact, I think my estranged spouse is a liar, and she's an untrustworthy person. Well, the carrier doesn't buy any of that version from the husband. They pay the claim eventually. But Burns still sues her estranged husband for slander and prevails. She has to prove damages, and even though her claim got paid, so that's not damage, she had to take time off from work to prove her claim, and she had to hire a lawyer. So she proved damages, the ex-husband or the estranged husband in for compensatory and punitive damages. In Forbes versus King's Shooters, this is one where Forbes goes to King's Shooters, where they sell guns and ammo, buys guns and ammo. No problem at all. Everybody's happy with her appearance and her performance. She comes back to the store and says, I can't unload this gun. I can't figure out how to get the ammo out of it. And for whatever reason, whether it was simply because she thought she might unload a gun or whatever how she was acting, the people at King's Shooters call the police and say, we think this lady perhaps ought to be involuntarily committed. The police come based on what King's Shooters said. They have her involuntarily committed. Well, we've looked at two cases where what people said got them in trouble. Here, the King's Shooter people spoke to the police. This woman was committed. When she gets out, she sues them. And what the court says is if you are making a report to the police or to mental health officials that suggest that involuntary commitment is needed, your communications are absolutely privileged, even if they're false or malicious. So I guess the real lesson here is that Woolard in the first case and the the estranged spouse in the second case should have said that the people they were talking about were crazy, as opposed to disputing over the amount of change or calling the estranged spouse a liar. Because if they had said they're crazy and ought to be involuntarily committed, that would have been protected communication. Next slide, right of way. Real quickly on this one, again, only Philadelphia could produce this, I guess. Matthews, a bicyclist, admits he goes through a stop sign. He's hit by Petroni, a motorist at the four-way stop sign. And he says, I went through the stop sign, but she didn't yield to traffic on the right. So, I ought to prevail. No, the Superior Court says, and the Supreme Court denies Alan Carter, that there's a hierarchy of rules of the road. And when you go through a stop sign, you really can't claim that you're still entitled to protection because you're the traffic on the right. Next, we have the Fair Share Act. Very quickly, under the Uniform Contribution Among Joint Tortfeasors Act, a 1% liable defendant owes the entire verdict. That got altered by the Fair Share Act, which said, no, it really has to be 60% or more. Below that, we're only going to hold you for your share. So the 1% person under the Fair Share Act only owes 1% if that's their share of liability. In this case, there are multiple defendants. None of them met that 60% threshold, but one defendant owed money and a different defendant was found liable and also owed money vicariously for that first defendant. What Spencer wanted to do was aggregate the two amounts, because if you added those two together, it got above the 60%, and he could then hold the deep pocket in for the entire amount. The court never got to that issue. They said that Spencer was negligence-free, and since he was negligence-free, the Fair Share Act didn't even apply. Didn't have anything to do with him, and in fact, he was entitled to collect the full amount from any of the defendants. That's a two-judge opinion from the Superior Court. They heard it with a three-judge panel. One judge didn't participate, so you got two judges who came to this result. Caused a buzz, I can tell you. So I guess we're waiting to see whether or not there will be a hearing en banc or an appeal to the Supreme Court. Finally, Shiflett, finally on torts, general verdict. This is mostly for the lawyers, I guess. Be wary. Shiflett sues the hospital on multiple counts. During the litigation, adds yet another account, which is beyond the statute of limitations, and that shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't have allowed that to be done, but they did. The case then goes to trial and results in a general verdict. And the general verdict means the jury was asked to say, do they owe the money, and if so, how much? They weren't asked to break it down count by count by count to figure out how they were allocating their money. On appeal, the hospital says, that count that they added late, they should not have been allowed to do that. It's after the statute. The court says, yeah, you're right. They shouldn't have been allowed to. That was clearly error to allow that late count to be added. However, as an appellant, you need to show more than just error. You have to show error that made a difference. And you can't do that because you didn't ask the jury to allocate the damages among the various counts, including the one that never should have been in there. And because you didn't do that, there's just a general verdict. You got to pay the whole thing. There's no way to go back and fix that after a general verdict has been entered. Statute of limitations, very quickly. Trees, for those of you who have homeowners coverage, you got a neighbor complaining about another neighbor because his trees are infringing on the property, etc. Well, statute of limitations is a rolling statute of limitations. Every day the sun comes up, that tree is still dropping branches, leaves, acorns, it's still blocking shade, whatever it's doing to create a nuisance. Well, that's happening anew all the time. So the statute of limitations is being for new actions, starting again and again and again and again. You can't say you knew about that tree 6 years ago. Why are you bringing a lawsuit now? Well, if it's still causing whatever that nuisance is, you can still bring the lawsuit. Clark versus Stover is legal malpractice. Clark wants to sue his lawyer, but has clearly not met the 2-year tort limitations period or the 4-year contract limitations period. He wants the court to adopt the end of representation rule, which many jurisdictions are now doing. It's sort of the leading way to handle this. And that is the statute doesn't even start to run until the representation has ended because you have that fiduciary relationship. The Supreme Court says, well, that's as may be, and maybe that's a great idea, but that's not for us to do. You have to go to the legislature if you want to have that type of change. You didn't meet the 2 or 4 year statutes, therefore you lose. Kelly versus Carmen is the statute of limitations in an insurance broker claim. Kelly suffers a loss. turns it over to Carmen, his broker, to turn over to the insurance company. Carmen does not do that. As a result, there's a default judgment in the litigation. As a result, the carrier denies coverage because of the prejudice caused by the default judgment. In terms of figuring out the statute of limitations, the court says, yeah, well, the statute started to run when the default was entered and not at the time the carrier later denied coverage. The difference being it was barred because they had not done it at that earlier date. What I found more intriguing and valuable, at least for lawyers in this case, is in the underlying case, the parties had stipulated to a $5 million damage award and then signed over their rights to the plaintiff, right? For, whatever, I'll sign it over and somebody else can chase this money. I'll stipulate to anything as long as you're not going to try and collect it against me. That's what happened in this case. But what the court said is that you're not bound by that. So when the parties in the underlying action stipulate to damages and then come to you saying you owe $5 million if you're the one that's in that situation, you are not bound by that earlier stipulation. You have a right to litigate damages on your own. I know we're short on time here. The good news is I'm actually getting close to the end of the presentation, but let's jump to procedure very quickly. Arbitration. Both Pennsylvania and the federal government love arbitration, favor arbitration. Public policy is greatly in favor of arbitration whenever possible. However, it's possible to screw that up. In Di Donato, the defendant tried to remove the case to federal court. It got sent back on remand. They tried to change venue in the state court system. And only when that was done, and more than a year's gone by at this point, do they raise the arbitration clause, which they say is dispositive on whether we go to arbitration. Court says, nope, you waited too long. You've waived the right to raise that arbitration agreement. In McElwain, it's of someone being admitted to a healthcare facility, an elderly person who is subject to a temporary guardianship order from out of state. That person signs the arbitration agreement. Later, they try to bring a claim against Sabre Healthcare. They raise the arbitration agreement. Court says, nope, that person was not an authorized agent. And while we favor arbitration, we're not going to make it happen where it's not an authorized agent or the patient itself. Next, I think still within procedure is Mankiewicz. I put this in, again, it's another case I put in because I've been reporting on it for 20 years or so. This is the case where Dr. Mankiewicz, back in the day, many of you may not know it now, he was a prominent orthopedic surgeon. So was his brother in Montgomery County. And they showed up in our cases all the time. They were treating physicians. They were IME physicians. Well, this Mankiewicz is the subject of a 1997 article from Peerless Publishing, which said Mankiewicz's sudden absence from the hospital has spawned rampant rumors of professional misconduct regarding his treatment of an older female patient. That was the offending quote. Well, the problem with that quote is it was mostly all true. I mean, there was a sudden absence. His admitting rights had been revoked. It did have rumors going up and down the halls. That was for sure true. It did involve allegations of professional misconduct. That was true. And it did involve his treatment of an older female patient. All of that was true. The problem is the treatment was he yelled at her. It wasn't sexual misconduct or anything like that. So he brought a claim for defamation by innuendo. And he wins after being up and down and up and down. He gets $1 million compensatory award and $1 million punitive damage award. I put it in here just in case anybody has been wondering how that turned out for the now long retired Dr. Mankiewicz. Well, he gets $1 million compensatory award, says the Supreme Court, and it's remanded for some further proceedings and calculations with regard to the $1 million punitive damage award. Finally, under procedure is the judge being present during voir dire. In this case, this varies county to county. Voir dire is where the lawyers get to go in and ask questions about the lawyers. I'm sorry, about the jurors and try and figure out who it is that's unfairly prejudiced. For instance, that job that got done in the Pearson case with the Eagles must have removed a lot of Eagles fans. But voir dire is you get to talk to the lawyer and figure out that the jurors, get to see who be fair or not. In Philadelphia County, it was most certainly the procedure that there was nowhere a judge to be found. You know, this would be done by the lawyers. It was the Wild West. People would say all sorts of things, probably if they shouldn't be saying to the prospective jurors. It varied county by county. If you went to Chester County, the lawyer never got to open his mouth. If the voir dire was done by the judge, and usually 15 minutes after you started, you had a jury and the panel ready to go. Well, here, in an Allegheny County case, the court ruled that the procedures was flawed without a judge present. The Superior Court says, no, without the judge, that really flaws the entire jury selection process. Therefore, a new trial is appropriate in this case since the judge wasn't present at voir dire. Well, boy, did this ever cause a flurry of activity throughout the state and all the counties trying to figure out how have we been doing voir dire and how should we be doing. It gets its way up to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court says is that the issue is waived. It was not preserved at the time of trial. Therefore, the whole concept of whether a judge should or should not have been present has been waived, and we're not deciding that. So a flurry of activity, it probably has sharpened up the practice of how jury selection takes place across the Commonwealth, but really no definitive ruling on it as yet. Next, we have venue. Venue is that litigation tourism issue we have with Philadelphia, where people want to be in Philadelphia because it's a favorable jurisdiction for any number of cases, and you get big verdicts. The two cases we have in venue are Fox and the Hangy case. In Fox, it was internet defamation. Fox was running to be mayor of Chester Heights in Delaware County. He was running against Smith. Smith on the internet said bad things about Fox, including that he had a criminal record, which Fox says wasn't true. Fox loses the election. Smith wins. Fox sues Smith for defamation. He has the good sense not to file in Delaware County. That's where he lost the election. People apparently believe he is a criminal. So he filed in the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas. There's a challenge there to his venue. It was based on internet comments, and the court finds, as long as there's evidence that someone in Philadelphia accessed this internet defamation and understood it to be defaming Fox, that's enough to set venue in Philadelphia County. In Hangy, it has to do with the sale of fancy lawn mowing equipment. Husqvarna is an international multi-billion-dollar company that sells fancy gardening and lawn mowing equipment. In particular, this is a product that was bought in Bucks County for use in Wayne County, where the accident happened. The guy managed to get himself run over by this fancy lawnmower, and he sues Husqvarna. And the question is whether or not venue can be set. Where do you think? Philadelphia County, litigation tourism. Well, they do have a sales agent in litigation county. He might average a sale or two a year, not a whole lot. And the court says, well, you're seeking that set venue here based on Husqvarna regularly conducting business in Philadelphia County. And it's a two-pronged test. First, you have to figure out quality of contacts and then quantity. Quality is you're trying to sell your stuff. Well, all right, that meets the quality test. Now, quantity is like, well, how much are you really doing? All right. And Husqvarna says, well, we make so much money. Our sales in Philadelphia represent 0.005% of our US sales. I mean, infinitesimal. That couldn't possibly meet the test of regularly conducting business in accounting. Well, Superior Court says, no, it does meet the test, because the problem is you are a multi-billion-dollar company. So your share of business in any county, in the Commonwealth, in the country, it's all going to be small numbers. That's the nature of how you sell your product. So no, that's enough. You have a sales agent here. You do make sales on an annual basis. That's enough for us to meet the quantity part of that two-pronged test. Finally, we'll do waiver of liability. I have a section on lawyers, but probably only lawyers care about that. On waiver, two cases. One is the Felicia case. Again, I've reported on this before, is why I reported on it again. It's athletes at Lackawanna College. The college had promised them that they would have licensed athletic trainers at every practice, etc. They couldn't do that. The guys, the people they got for that job all failed the test. So they didn't get rid of them. They just changed their names. They stopped calling them athletic trainers and called them first responders, which is a name you just make up and doesn't require certification. These folks get hurt and sue the college. They had signed waivers of liability. The important takeaway from this case is that the Supreme Court says that those written waivers of liability are not applicable to claims based on gross negligence or recklessness. As a matter of public policy, you can't waive your rights on that. So the negligence claims, yes. Gross negligence or recklessness, no, the waivers don't apply. In the Valentino case, another one again I've reported several times during these presentations. This is the poor guy who's entering the Philadelphia Triathlon. On the first leg of the triathlon, which is swimming in the Schuylkill River, he drowns. He had signed a waiver of liability, and the question of whether or not his signing that would bar survival and wrongful death actions. And the answer is yes. He signed it, and as long as it would be otherwise a valid waiver of liability to a living person, the fact that he didn't survive the event doesn't matter, still bars both the survival and wrongful death actions. Okay, I think I will skip the attorney part and jump. Oh, well, there you go. You get a picture of me. If anyone really wants to contact me about any of this presentation or any questions you have on any of these matters, including the ones I skipped over, you know where to find me. There's my office number, my cell number, and my email address. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. That was absolutely fascinating. And I feel a little breathless, for you. I mean, there was a lot of material. Unbelievable. Okay. We're off to lunch now, and we're going to get back together at 1 o'clock. But what you're going to have to do is log out of this session and then log back into it this afternoon in order, to be able to access everything that we have going on, which is at 1 o'clock is a very timely presentation on hail damage. The season's upon us. And then we also have a fascinating look into ATF forensic auditing and arson investigation. So see y'all after lunch at 1. And thank you again, Mike. That was just wonderful. I can't believe you got through all of that in the amount of time that you did. Very impressive.
Thank you.
See you later.